the amount of nitrous oxide. You get the same kind of things in terms of the amount of fisheries, the amount of fish that have been captured, that are caught in the oceans. And then it falls off precipitously in the same way, which you have to remember about all of this. And so what you see is things like this, that the world's population has grown more in the last 50 years than in the 4 million years that preceded it. Now you think about that for a second, because I need you to think about some of these things. Don't just let them fly past your head and go just, let the numbers go. You think about this. This makes a difference. More people in the last 50 years than the 4 million years before. That shakes the system. It changes the system. It threatens the system. It generates all kinds of subsidiary, secondary kind of problems that you wouldn't otherwise have if you didn't have so many people. And so here's the rate it goes. What we're heading ourselves towards is something like, 9.5, 10 billion people is what they think. But there was a place starting in 1950 or something like that, if you work your way up to 1950, where you see a doubling of the world's population in a lifetime if you were born in 1950 or something like that. I mean, it's extraordinary. There's been no time in history where you've seen that kind of change before. And the part of the problem is that it's not even across the world. It's not in the United States, and it's not in Europe here, where they have an infertility time bomb. No, the problem is all in other parts of the world. Here's some projections for population going up to 2050. The dark line is 2050. And you can see that the population projections are all, the big ones are in Asia and in Africa. As it grows between now and 2025 and 2050. And so the mass of the population growth is going to be in Asia, India, and mostly, and in China, and then in Africa as well. And what's interesting about that is that it is reconfiguring in its own way the whole way in which the world is going to operate. Because the red line is China and their population, the blue line is India, and you can see that no matter which of the scenarios, which one of these projections, the lines of growth that you take, that somewhere out here around 2020 or 2025, India becomes the most populous country in the world. And why is that important? Because up until this year, both India and China both had 8 to 10% GDP growth. And so what they are is huge engines for economic growth. And what's happening on this planet is there's a movement away. That started in that the locus of economic kind of force was in Europe. It moved to the United States, and it's headed west. And it's on its way to China. And China is, absent a wild card, and we'll talk a little bit about wild cards, big surprises and things that could come up. China is going to be the place where that drives the whole system in the matter of 20 years or so. Now you start to see these same kind of relationships in energy. Here's the chart of all of the accumulated kind of production of oil, petroleum. And what you can see is that you're approaching up here through past the year 2000 is that we're approaching the peak of oil production. We're not getting to the end of oil, but we're at the beginning of the end of oil when you get to the top up here. These are all the different sources that you got, and what you can see is that they've all peaked at one time or another. Here is the lower 48 of the United States, peaked in 1974 or something like that. And then what you get is these constant kind of peaks that Mexico, the big oil fields in Mexico have peaked now. What you've got is indications that Saudi Arabia has peaked. They've been pumping the same thing for the last 3 years. And what's important about that is that here's world production going up. This guy's surfing this wave, I guess. And if you smooth it out, what you see is it's starting to curve over and it's getting to the top. Now, nobody can argue that it's going to peak sometime. You can argue about when it's going to peak and whether it's... But when you look at these kinds of curves, it convinces me, at least, and a whole lot of other kind of folks, that we're approaching the peak. As a matter of fact, it's been flat for the last, 3 years. the production has been flat. And we may find after the fact, in a year or so on, that we've reached the peak, because then it starts down. The interesting thing about this thing is when you look historically about how the relationship of discoveries of oil, of petroleum, what you see is that the petroleum discoveries peaked 44 years ago. And from since then, it's been decreasing ever since. If you look at the United States as an example, you will see that the petroleum finds discoveries peaked 40 years before the production peaked and headed down. And so there's reason to believe, if you look at the history of all of this, that we may well be at the peak. This is a piece of concrete or something. It's an obstruction, and it can't go any higher than that. That's what that is. But anyway, we may be at the peak. And if we're at the peak, then what happens is that it heads down. And when it heads down, most people think at about 4 or 5 to 6% or something like that. If you take 5% decrease every year, you do the math. 10 years out, how much less production have you got than you had, 10 years before? Turns out to be about 40% or 45% or something like that. You think about that. If all of the production of petroleum in this world decreases by 40% in the next 10 years, what have you got? A big, big problem. Because the demand continues. Here's the demand, keeps going up like this, and the supply goes down, and somehow you have to make up for that. I'll give you a good example of what that is. In China, China's got a big problem, and their big problem is one of 3 big problems that they got, but one of their biggest problems is how in the world do they maintain domestic stability. In 2004, their interior minister said that they had something like 47,000 riots in China because of all of the poor people and all of the problems that they got. In 2005, it was something like 75,000 riots. And so you've got this huge amount. They have a huge problem trying to keep domestic stability in that country. And how do they do it? Their whole purpose their whole strategy is to keep the economy growing. If they can keep the economy growing, keep people encouraged, then they keep the stability down. They keep the stable and the instability down. But if they can't keep the economy going, then they got really big domestic problems. Now, how do they do this? They do this with emblematic kind of advances in the economy. It started with refrigerators. They decided a long time ago at the beginning of this big economic boom that the thing that they were going to encourage everybody to do is to get a refrigerator. They made a huge, huge mistake because they didn't care about the efficiency of the refrigerators, and so they bought millions and millions of refrigerators and put them in place in homes, and now they are building 1 power plant a week just to support the energy requirements for all these inefficient refrigerators. Now the emblematic thing that they pushed into the system, and they told everybody, because they watch TV after all, they want a car. Everybody wants a car. There's only about 3 people per 1,000 that have a car in China. And so this is the thing that they want to do. And so then the question is, if you built this encouragement, if you built these images into people's minds and they said that that's how I get ahead, and you hit a point like this and the supply goes down and the demand keeps going, what does it generate in China? Domestic instability. You've got big kinds of problems if you can't keep that engine going. You start to build all kinds of scenarios out here about what might happen up there. You could build war. You could have wars over energy and all kinds of other kind of things because this is a big, big deal. This is a really big deal. What would China do? Well, maybe they may come over to Hugo Chavez and they make a deal with Venezuela, right? Chavez doesn't like us. Why wouldn't he like to sell his oil to Venezuela? To China.